Welcome to DX101's look at the top 10 countries from North and South America that you can try to hear tonight on AM radio. And this is the companion video for an article that I wrote for the Spectrum Monitor magazine, the July 2022 edition of the Spectrum Monitor. So make sure you go to thespectrummonitor.com to pick up your copy or even subscribe to the magazine. Now, for this segment, we're going to actually break up the video into three parts. Because it turned out there's a lot here to talk about and a lot to dissect when we're kind of listening to these air checks. So the first segment we're doing, this one, is actually going to look at the first three countries on our list. Segment 2, part 2, is going to look at the rest of our top 10, so everything from 4 through 10. And then in our final segment, we're going to throw in a couple of extra countries for you, some little tidbits for you. We call here in Louisiana a little lagniappe. And we're also in a YouTube DX Central YouTube channel exclusive. You're not going to see this anywhere else. We're going to actually talk about some resources or a resource that you can use online to help you in your search for some of these countries that we're talking about in our list. So sit back and relax. It's part 1 of DX101's look at the top 10 countries you can try to hear tonight on AM radio right here for DX Central.
Keep up with DX Central. Follow us on Twitter at DX Central.
So recently I was on social media, kind of the AMDX corners of social media, and I saw a question from a DXer, and it's something that I see pretty frequently, especially among newer DXers who are located in kind of the US or Canada, and that is, other than those two countries, what else is there really for me to DX on AM radio? And it can be very easy to kind of feel like all you hear is your own country or one of those two, either US or Canada, when you're a US or Canadian DXer. I got to thinking about the topic and, what else is there to be heard? If I was to kind of stick closer to home, North and South America, let's say the top 10 countries that I could hear in any given night, like tonight on AMDX. So we're going to take a look at that with some examples for you to actually hear some of these countries. Stay tuned. As a young DXer of the AM variety back in the early 90s, I found myself kind of being intrigued or kind of gravitating towards what I kind of look at as exotic DX. Now, I grew up in a radio household. My mother and father, as many of you know, are DXers in the radio hobby. We're writers in that, and mom, especially on the shortwave side, kind of gravitated towards kind of the tropics, right? The tropical bands, and not the huge mega million-watt broadcasters, although she did that. She really enjoyed like the little small ones down in Peru or in the southern Pacific areas or something little bitty over in Africa, right? I kind of gravitated towards that when I was doing shortwave DX as well. And then when I started doing AM, I kind of followed suit. I looked at those kind of areas as being areas that were of big interest to me, especially Latin America. When I was a little kid, Latin America held a special fascination. So when I began AMDXing, I saw the Mark Conleys and Alan Willies and Bruce Contis and others who were hearing deep into Europe, or Bruce up in Washington, or Patrick Martin up in Oregon hearing into Asia and the South Pacific and stuff. I could see all those guys doing that, and I thought, wow, that's amazing. But I felt like that was a little out of my reach based on my know-how, my setup, and my geography, to be honest. So I said, let me stick a little closer to home and really just try to focus on hearing as many countries as I can within my immediate realm of influence here in North and South America. So if I was kind of putting together a list of the top 10 countries that I could try to hear today or any given night on AM radio, what would they be? And I wrote an article about it for the Spectrum Monitor, spectrummonitor.com. And let me take a second to talk about that. Now, I get no kickbacks here. It's $3 for an issue. And our article on this topic is in the July 2022 edition of the Spectrum Monitor. So if you do nothing else, go pick up the article that goes along with what we're talking about here today, because I'm going to go into a lot more detail in the article than I do here about some of the tips and tricks and things. But then it's only, I think, $34 to subscribe for 12 issues, which gets you an entire year, right? January through December. At the very least, pick up this July 2022 issue so you can read extra information that I'm not going to be sharing here in the video. What we are going to do today in the video, though, is we're going to delve into what I kind of call the top 10 countries in North and South America, plus a few extras that I'll throw in just for fun, that you can try to hear tonight. Now, as we start the list, the top of the list here is numbers 1 and 2 and so forth. It's a little bit easier. And then we get a little bit harder as we go through the list. And then by the time we get to our little extras collection, it's a bit more advanced. And I've put together a playlist here on our YouTube channel. We'll put a link in the video description so you can listen to these at any time. And we're going to start with country number 1, Cuba, because just about everybody in North and South America, and I'm being very broad brushed here, just about everybody should be able to hear Cuba. And there's a couple of reasons why. The first one that we're going to talk about here is one of those reasons. There's not a lot of radio stations on 530 kilohertz. There's one up in Ontario, and then there's 2 in the country of Cuba. There's a bunch of small TIS stations and things like that, but there's only 2 real stations of any substantial power on this frequency at this time, right? We know this can change, but as of right now, June of 2022, there are really only these 2 stations in Cuba and the one up in Ontario. The first one we're going to talk about is the stronger of the 2. It's called Radio Encyclopedia. And they play kind of easy listening, kind of instrumental music, orchestral music, things like that. This is kind of their dominant format. And then they also, underneath them, there's a second station out of Cuba. It is a outlet from their national network, Radio Rebelde, which we'll be coming back to here in a few moments on another air check. But here, you're going to actually hear a ID and air check identification from both stations out of Cuba. 530, Radio Encyclopedia and Radio Rebelde.
Cultura del Grupo Empresarial Cuba quienes brindaron detalles sobre el impacto de la tarea de ordenamiento. Transmite este enciclopedia desde La Habana, Cuba. Desde La Habana, emisora de la... Esta es la hora en Cuba, las 8. Enciclopedia presenta Más allá de un tiempo.
Okay, so it can be a little hard for someone who's not familiar with these 2 stations to kind of sort through them and know which one is which. We're going to play an example later from Radio Rebelde. You'll see very clearly what part of what you just heard is Rebelde and what part is Encyclopedia. The female, obviously, is the Encyclopedia. And some of the kind of guitar orchestral music you were hearing at the beginning, instrumental stuff, that was Encyclopedia. The organ, this kind of off-tune sounding organ, that's Rebelde. Well, again, we'll hear that next, or one of the examples we'll have here coming up in a few moments as well from Rebelde. But these are probably 2 of the easier stations to hear from the country of Cuba for the vast majority of North and South America. There's another one a little bit further down the list here in Cuba that is the easiest, I would say. But Rebelde and Encyclopedia are probably up there in the very tip top of that list. For the next example, we're actually going to look at another station that is a national network of Cuba. These national networks of Cuba, they occupy more than just one frequency. So Rebelde is a network, Progresso is a network, and then there's another one, Radio Reload. There's a couple of others as well, but those are the 3 main ones. And Progresso is on a number of frequencies, as is Rebeldy, as is Rouleau. But for a lot of U.S. DXers, especially in the South, 640 and 890, those are your two most dominant frequencies for Radio Progresso. Now, there's a lot of different things that they'll play on Radio Progresso. Usually it's music-oriented, including U.S.-based music that trips some folks up. They'll hear a U.S. Pop song or maybe some oldies, and they'll think, hey, who I got here? And it's Progresso. And so one of the things they actually do is they have a little song that they play. I've heard it the bottom half of the hour. I've heard it at the top of the hour. I've heard it all over the place. But check this out. This is Radio Progresso. This is the 640 outlet, but again, there are many others as well.
Cadena nacional, la onda de la alegría, transmitiendo desde La Habana, Cuba, primer territorio libre en América. Jamás nuestra tierra tuvo tanto amor, ni tan bello adiós del soldado.
So an interesting little nugget about that song. I was once sitting on 1230 kilohertz. It's a graveyard frequency. And I could actually, weekly, there's the rumble of all the graveyard stations. But very weak, I heard that song. That was it. I was able to log a station from Cuba on a graveyard frequency solely based on the fact that I heard that song. It cut through that well. It's a fantastic way to cut through the static. Speaking of extremely easy to hear and cuts through like a knife, that brings us to our next station on the list from Cuba, Radio Reloj. So let me set the context for you on this particular station. Again, just like with Progresso and Rebeldy, there are a number of different frequencies that you'll be able to hear Reloj on. I talk about those in the article in the Spectrum Monitor. What makes Reloj easy to hear, and this is what, for me, puts Cuba at the top of this list, is because of this network, Radio Reloj. They have 1 minute little segments of news that they do. I think they were like the first 24/7 news station, actually, in the world, is my understanding. They claim to be, at least. But they'll do these 1 minute little nuggets of news, and then they may carry it over that story into the next minute. You'll hear like continuar, or they'll end the story, and then you'll hear like Radio Reloj, and then you'll hear a tone and the letters RR in Morse code. Those two things are what sticks out. Now, they also do time pips on the seconds. You'll hear the little, sounds like a wood clock on the seconds, right? If you're close enough, you can hear that as well. But what everybody hears, and I've seen this so many times on social media. I'm on 860 right now, and I hear a beep and then Morse code. Is someone doing a DX test? It's Radio Reloj. Man, it's Radio Reloj. RR in Morse code. And I tell you, it cuts through so easy. People all over the world hear Radio Reloj simply based off of the RR Morse code and the beep. It's a fantastic option if you're wanting to add the country of Cuba. Again, we talk about the frequencies in the article in the Spectrum Monitor, the July 2022 issue. But here's an example from 870, which for me is usually one of the easier frequencies to hear Reloj, because you have WWL in New Orleans on this frequency, and it kind of clears a wide path because there's not much else there. to kind of clog up the works a bit, right? There's not a ton of other stations on that frequency that could kind of interfere. So it's WWL and real low, and it sticks out so easy. So what you're going to hear is you're going to hear the seconds tick. You're going to hear the announcer in Spanish reading the news, and then you'll hear Radio Reloj, and then you'll hear the beep and the RR in Morse code.
El cuadro básico no cambia sus precios. Festeja Cuba 6 décadas de intercambio diplomático con 7 naciones del continente asiático. Brigada médica cubana se destaca durante los 6 meses de combate contra la COVID-19 en Perú. Los titulares continuarán.
Yeah, you can have all the plans in the world, but if you have bad players and they can't execute, then you're done, or you can have great players, but if they're not...
You'll also notice there was a little bit of it sounded like the Morse code starting weakly, and then it started on, again, really strong. A lot of these Cubans have more than one transmitter on the island for the same network. You'll actually see here on the list on the screen, there are 3 known transmitters of Radio Reloj on this frequency, 2 10Ks and 1 kilowatt. So sometimes you'll have like a bit of an echo. We're going to get to that again here in a moment with Rebeldy. So you have sometimes a little bit of an echo on their content. That helps it kind of stand out again. This particular frequency, 870, has been, it may not still be by the time you're watching this video, but it has been now for about a year the culprit behind the infamous warbler on 870. Another thing I see on social media all the time is I'm listening to WWL and I hear this warble, and everyone thought at first it was WWL's transmitter that was damaged by Hurricane Ida. No, it's not. If you listen very closely, especially if you're in close to the southern U.S. and you can get a good signal on like the news part, what you just heard, you'll actually hear the warble is with the modulation of Radio Reloj. And so the Morse code actually goes, it's just this weird sound to it. So if you hear like a very kind of a warble on frequency, it's Reloj. Their transmitter is modulating horribly. The Cuban warble is pretty widely heard and pretty common, so you may notice that if you're on 870. If you hear that, that's another thing you can use to identify who you're hearing. Speaking of Rebeldy, one last thing on Reloj before we go on to Rebeldy. The Morse code ID, Monday through Saturday. On Sundays, they don't do the Morse code ID, not the whole day at least. They do these chimes. It goes do 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 do.
Debe ser con Hackman, si no, Hannibal Lecter. La de reloj 11-20 minutos.
Now, let's talk about Radio Rebeldy. There are a number of different outlets for Rebeldy, a number of frequencies you can hear them on. We talked about 530 already. 670 is a very common one. 1180. I have actually heard Radio Rebeldy on 1180 on my AirSpy HF Plus Discovery SDR, a W6 LVP loop, portable, smaller version, inside of a hotel room in Lake Forest, California, on the West Coast, like a couple of minutes from the beach, from the ocean. I heard Radio Rebeldy on 1180 from California. Our good friend of the channel, Stephanie, out in California, she's heard Rebeldy on, I think it was 1620, which is what we're about to listen to here in a moment. She heard them from California. Rebeldy is one of those that sticks out very, very well, and there's a very specific reason why, and we're going to point it out here in a second. Their top of the hour sequence can be a little bit different depending on the hour you're listening. It usually is a good time to start listening for it is around 58 after the hour, 57, 58 after the hour. There are 2 sequences that they kind of do with their top of the hour. We're going to play examples of both for you now. Let's start with the first one. I'm going to rewind it here a second. You already hear the kind of organ sound. That's what we heard earlier on 5:30. That's Rebelde. Vintage Rebelde.
Rebelde La Habana, la emisora de la revolución. Cuba, exactamente 6 de la mañana.
All right, so let's talk a bit about what we've just heard. This is actually their one that you hear right around the top of the hour. There's a couple of things I want to kind of point out. We're going to rewind it here as we go. So we heard the Rebelde de La Habana, right? So we have the audible ID. We heard the organ, very unique to Rebelde. We heard that little kind of keyboard melody that I was kind of dancing to, right? That's another thing that's pretty unique to Rebelde. But the number one thing, and this is what I heard from California that made me go, ooh, that's Rebelde, is this little 9-note melody. And the way I remember it is it sounds like it's going, Rebelde, Rebelde, Rebelde. Now, sometimes they play it fast. Sometimes they play it slow. So it may be that, maybe Rebelde, Rebelde, Rebelde. Might be really fast like that. But either way, that little 9-note melody, that's Rebelde. You can hear that so well. Like I said, from California on 1180, I heard it. It's one of the only things I heard a little bit of content, but I could hear the Spanish talking. But I would have never been able to pick out like audible things to kind of gravitate towards. But I heard that 9-note melody and I knew that's Rebelde. So let's go back a little bit here. Rebelde, Rebelde, Rebelde. That one. We're going to hear that again on the next clip. But that's the one that I want to make sure that you kind of gravitate towards. That's the clue. That's the Rebelde melody that you'll hear and instantly know who you're hearing. So let's go to the next clip. This is, I believe this next one is the one that's around 58 after the hour. So this actually precedes the top of the hour. You'll have an ID. You'll have the 9-note melody twice. And then they usually, I think they go into news or noticias. They go into the news right after this.
Desde 1958 trabajamos pensando. Radio La Habana. Lo que necesitas para estar al día. Las noticias. Estos son los titulares. Rinden homenaje principal.
All right, so I'm going to kind of pause it right there. We're going to rewind this again. We heard the 9-note melody twice. You heard that little bump, bump, bump. And then you heard it. Another thing that's in there that kind of sticks out, especially if you're a little bit closer, is it's kind of this little... It sounds like a beginning of a Dire Straits song. It sounds like the beginning of Money for Nothing, I always thought. I'll play it again here for you, though. So that little part right there, that I've heard that so many times. That's another clue that I've got Rebelde. Now, let's go back into the next little bit.
Lo que necesitas para estar al día.
So there you go. That little sequence, the little Dire Straits sound, and then Rebelde, Rebelde, Rebelde. kind of a little delay on that last note, that 9-note melody, that's how you know you got rebellion. So again, we talk about a lot of the frequencies in the article on the Spectrum Monitor, but 1620 is a good one. 1180 is probably the easiest one because I think they've got like 20 some odd transmitters or more, 30 odd transmitters on that frequency alone, all doing rebellion all at the same time. So you have this big echo. And to actually hear the echo of that 9-note melody sometimes, it can get a little confusing. Let's go to our next country on the list, staying pretty close to home for U.S. and Canadian DXers. Let's go to Mexico. So speaking of Lake Forest and my little Air Spy loop set up in the hotel room, this recording you're about to hear actually came from Lake Forest. I was out there doing some work on my day job and set up a recording in my hotel room with my SDR and my loop. And so this is one of the stations that I grabbed. So this is actually a pretty easy one for our West Coast DXers, especially to be able to hear out of Mexico. There are options on the East Coast. We'll talk about those, especially in the article. You'll see a lot of those in the article. East and West Coasters to be able to hear. But this is XESURF, and I think it's a good representation of what you're going to hear a lot of times out of stations out of Mexico. I highly recommend, highly recommend that you go to ircaonline.org. Write that down. Again, that's ircaonline.org. That's the International Radio Club of America. Go there, go to their publication section. They have an area for their free publications. The IRCA Mexican log. Get the most recent version that is there. Tim Hall from the IRCA helps put this together. He is a mastermind when it comes to Mexican DX. He's put a huge amount of information in there about not only the stations you can hear, but some of the things to listen for and what they do. A lot of the stations in Mexico will play their national anthem, but there are different variants of the national anthem, and what you hear can kind of tell you who it is you're hearing, because there's a lot of times more than one station in Mexico on a given frequency, right? So definitely go to the IRCA website. Again, it's ircaonline.org. Get a copy of the IRCA Mexican log. As of right now, June 22, there is a free copy on their website you can go download. I just did it recently. It's a free copy of the publication that you can download, the IRCA Mexican log. I highly recommend you become a member of both NRC and IRCA. NationalRadioClub.org, IRCAOnline.org. Be a member of both clubs. This is 540 XESURF. And again, this is pretty indicative of a lot of what you're going to hear out of Mexico, regardless of the station.
Estás escuchando XESURF 540 AM, transmitiendo desde Tijuana, México, 540 AM.
All right, so that's XESURF on 540 kilohertz out of Tijuana. This next one also in Tijuana, XEKAM. Now, we don't mention this one, I don't believe, specifically in the article. But what we do have here, and I talked about the national anthem, this is an example of what you'll hear. Obviously, you want to familiarize yourself with the national anthem of Mexico so you'll know it when you hear it. Also, by the way, do the same thing with Cuba. They also play their national anthem, I think around midnight, local Cuban time. And I think noon as well, but definitely midnight for the overnight DXers. So you want to make sure you know the Cuban national anthem as well. This is going to be the Mexican. Now, again, there are different variants of the national anthem of Mexico that you'll hear on Mexican radio stations. Some sung by adults, some sung by children. Some you'll only hear like a verse or two. Some you'll hear 4 or 5 verses. Some are more indigenous sounding. Some are more kind of choral sounding. There's different variations. They talk about that in the IRCA Mexican log. But this is one example. This is from 950 XEKAM in Tijuana. Again, not one of the stations we necessarily mention as one that a lot of people should be able to hear, but it is an example of what you can hear for those stations playing the national anthem.
750 de amplitud modulada con 20.000 watts de potencia. Planta transmisora, kilómetro 22,5, carretera escénica Tijuana-Ensenada, en Baja Malibu. Estudios y oficinas en Boulevard Aguacaliente, número 8710, local 17 y 18, Colonia Centro. Teléfono área 664-684-2539. Radio Fórmula.
Now, Radio Formula is actually a network in Mexico. So there's more than one Radio Formula. I've heard quite a few on the more Gulf side of Mexico. A couple of things about that. The national anthem, I've heard stations ID going in. And then most of them ID like you just heard coming out. Some of them will do like the Radio Formula, and then they'll do the national anthem. So they'll like do a slight ID, and then the national anthem, and then they go into the longer version where they talk about how how many watts they have for their power and stuff like that. Mil watts de potencia, that whole thing. They'll talk about, sometimes they'll give out their phone number, their location, all kinds of different stuff. So some don't do that at all. Some of them come out of the national anthem and it's right back into content. So you'll want to definitely pick up the IRCA Mexican log. It talks about all that. It talks about how they ID. It talks about the national anthem variants that are out there. So definitely get ircaonline.org and download the most recent copy. For our next one, we're staying in Mexico. This is a station that a lot of people on the East Coast and the middle of the country should be able to hear. This is XEG out of Monterrey, Mexico.
Dios los haya perdonado, pues los mataron ahí. La más grande y poderosa en México y Estados Unidos, 1050M. Pura experiencia radiofónica. Seguimos innovando la radio en Monterrey.
Y al pie del cañón La Ranchera, dentro y fuera de la República Mexicana.
Cuauhtémoc 725 Norte Centro, Monterrey, Nuevo León, México. 10.000 watts de potencia efectivos.
De costa a costa.
Y de frontera a frontera, compa.
La ranchera, la más completa. La ranchera, la más completa. Hoy nomás, qué chulada.
Y sigue siendo la más completa.
La ranchera, la más completa.
De Núcleo Radio Monterrey. Son las 11:20 grados.
Núcleo Radio Monterrey no se hace responsable por el contenido de este programa.
Saludo cordial. Abrazo.
Now, you'll notice no national anthem there. So, yes, they typically only play them at certain times of the day. Usually midnight's a good one. Cuba and Mexico both usually you're going to hear the national anthem around midnight. Just about all their stations. Not all, most of them. I've also heard it at 1 o'clock in the morning out of Mexico. So it depends on where they are, what time zone they're in. But you'll hear that national anthem at various times. Again, the IRCA Mexican log is a huge help in getting you acclimated to it as far as what to expect out of Mexican stations. All right, so now we've done the two easy ones, Cuba and Mexico. Just about everybody should be able to hear at least one station out of those two if you're located in North and South America, and for many folks, beyond. For our next country, we're going to be, this is the one that kind of really sealed my fate. When I heard my first station from Colombia back in the 90s, it blew my mind, and I said, oh, I need more of this. So let's go to Colombia. All right, so as with most of these countries that we're looking at, Colombia has national networks, and that can help with trying to hear these countries, because a lot of times these national networks in Colombia typically, at least on certain frequencies, have a little bit higher power. You get to where you kind of recognize what you're listening for a bit. And they have great websites where you can go and listen to the website and run it parallel to what you're hearing and see if what you're hearing on air and what you're hearing on the website matches up. Usually, it's pretty close. Might be a little bit of a delay, so it's not like instant, but it's there. This first one is a good example of that. This is Caracol Radio on 810 kilohertz. And again, for all these countries, I go into detail giving you some great frequencies for the various networks or what to listen for. So I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail here on this video, but I at least want to give you the idea of what to listen for the stuff that we mentioned in the article. So Caracol Radio, here's what you're listening for.
Caracol Radio, con César Augusto Londoño y Oscar Rentería. Yo la verdad es que no creo que el Tolima todavía sea grande, Granada. No está ¿usted no cree? No, hablamos qué tiene que hacer el Tolima para convencer de César, por Dios. Ser más veces campeón y tener presencia internacional. Y algunos dicen que Once Caldas no es grande y ganó una Copa Libertadores. El Tolima en este momento tampoco es de los grandes. Yo respeto mucho a los países. Sí, y además imagino lo que ha conseguido nosotros. Es una cosa que el Tolima hace rato suena más que musical, pero en la historia todavía no es grande, qué pena. El pulso del fútbol, lunes a viernes, 1 de la tarde. Dirige César Augusto Londoño.
All right, so they kind of faded. They were starting to fade a little bit there towards the end, but that is a good example. They do a lot of sports on Caracol Radio, football, mostly. So that is a good example of a national network that's relatively easy to hear for most folks. 810 is a really good frequency for Caracol Radio. This next one that we're going to listen to, this specific outlet, this frequency, is not necessarily one that I think everyone's going to hear, but it gives a really good representation of this particular network. And that network is RCN. I want you to be able to hear when they ID what to listen for. I didn't know what to listen for when I first started listening to RCN, but once a good friend of mine, Mike Jeziorski down in Mexico, kind of described it, he said, listen for RCN. When you hear RCN Radio or RCN, that's RCN in Spanish, RCN. So listen in this next clip for RCN. That's how you know you've got RCN from Colombia.
RCN Radio y la Universidad del Rosario se unen para dar a conocer el trabajo de la academia y su importante aporte al país. En Miradas RCN, con Arito Quieta Pimentel, todos los sábados, de 9 a 10 de la noche, en RCN Radio. Miradas RCN. RCN Radio felicita a nuestra periodista.
How many times has he said RCN here? This clip, by the way, is the one that I sent Mike, and I was like, who do I have here? Who is this? And he's like, it's RCN Colombia. Listen for the RCN. And you can see how many times it was said here. I just didn't know that's what I was listening for, so I didn't know what to look for. But that's why I'm sharing it with you.
Por el reconocimiento hecho por el jurado del Premio Nacional de Periodismo Simón Bolívar, gracias a su trabajo, cómo se vive el pico de la pandemia desde el interior de una UCI.
Ernesto Gutiérrez, de RCN Radio, recibe un reconocimiento del jurado en Crónica Audio.
Una crónica que narra desde lo profundo de los servicios de cuidados intensivos del Hospital Santa Clara de Bogotá, la tragedia diaria que vivió el personal de salud en el momento más complicado de la pandemia de COVID-19.
La UCI COVID a la que ingresamos en el Hospital Santa Clara tenía su cama.
Leti Gutiérrez es RCN Radio.
Ya no tenía puesto el protector facial.
RCN Radio para
Now, let me give you a little bit of a extra little tidbit on this specific frequency outlet for RCN radio. There is a tiny island here. You can kind of see it on the map on the screen. It's off the coast of Central America here, right? And It's San Andres y Providencia. And as a ham radio operator, whenever I work a ham radio station that's on those islands, it counts as its own unique country. The country is owned by Colombia, which is weird because it's kind of far off the Colombian coast there. It's owned by Colombia. You have a Colombian network on the island, RCN, for the purposes of the IRCA, the NRC, and a couple of others I think I checked. They count San Andres y Providencia as its own country as well. The ARRL, the American Radio Relay League, ham radio, counts it as its own country. It doesn't count it as Colombia. It counts it as San Andres y Providencia. So if you tune to 910 and you're hearing RCN, guess what? You just heard the Colombian outlet of a brand new country for you. So I actually get to count, when I heard this one, I got to count that as a new country. Again, it's owned by Colombia. It's a Colombian network. But just like in the DX world, we count Puerto Rico as its own country. It's not considered a U.S. state. It's considered its own country, right? Same thing. Same basic premise here. That is the country of Puerto Rico. This is the country of San Andres y Providencia. So I wanted to share that with you guys because that was a thrilling moment. Once I realized I was hearing something Colombian, not in Colombia, and it counted as its own country. Hey, that's a bonus for you right there. We didn't even talk about this in the article, by the way. This is a bonus for you guys, for my YouTube folks. There's an extra country for you. So you have in the article lots of frequencies that we give for RCN radio out of Colombia. But for you guys on my YouTube channel, go check out 910 and see if you hear RCN. And if you do, that's another new country. So now we are ready to go to country number 4 on our list. Again, we're getting a little bit harder now. The first two, super easy. Colombia, for most folks, should be pretty easy. May not every night be able to hear them, but you're going to be able to get to them eventually, for the most part, in North and South America. This next one, though, is a little bit more challenging. Now, it's not as challenging as I originally thought. And this last year, during our medium wave DX frequency challenge for DX Central Live, I realized it's actually not as hard as I thought. A lot more folks were hearing this country than I realized. So I put it at number 4 on my list. We're going to the Bahamas. And that concludes our look at part 1 of the top 10 countries you can hear from North and South America tonight on AMDX. Starting with our first 3, we conclude the top 10 list here in part 2 on our next video. So make sure you click on the link above for that. And then also make sure you check out part 3, where we look at a couple of extra countries you can try for. And we're going to look at a DX Central YouTube exclusive of a tool that you can use to help you find these international stations. So stay tuned for parts 2 and 3 right here on DX Central. Thank you so much for watching this video, though. Hopefully it's been helpful for you, as always. If so, don't forget to give us a thumbs up and a comment down below. And also don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you can be notified when new videos are available. We'll see you in the next 2 parts, but until then, take care, my friends. 73 Best of DX. Now let's go hit the bands.